In the aftermath of last month's horrific attacks in Paris, security has been increased at synagogues and Jewish schools here. But what is the extent of anti-Semitism in Britain? Well, today a cross-party group of MPs has published an inquiry into anti-Semitism, looking at what can be done to combat it. Giles Dilnot's been talking to members of the Jewish community.
So that I made from scratch this morning.
Nearly lunchtime at a synagogue in North London, and Nicola Marzell is preparing food for a dozen guests. She does it every week. It's part of the everyday life of the place. And preserving the everyday, the ordinary, the peaceful seems to be a highly valued commodity to Britain's thriving Jewish community. But that is threatened. There's been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, from online abuse, graffiti, vandalism, but most worryingly, face-to-face racism. These incidents rose during Israel's recent conflict with Hamas to more than had been recorded in the whole of the previous year. The deliberate targeting of a Jewish supermarket after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris has merely added to concerns.
There are 120 community buildings now at risk of terrorist attack, the type we saw in Paris. Will my right honourable friend commit to looking at creating a counter-terrorism fund to help meeting the security measures at these community buildings?
Yeah. There's a misconception that this is all the fault of Muslims. There's also a misconception that it's all the fault of neo-Nazis. Actually, all sorts of people perpetrate anti-Semitic incidents. But at times of most tension, when the Middle East is the trigger, yes, the number of perpetrators who seem to be Muslim certainly increases.
There is no doubt pictures like these provoke strong reactions on both sides. There's a clear connection between such conflicts and the targeting of those most visibly Jewish on our streets. But Britain's Jews are not Israelis, and criticising a foreign country's government and its forces is not a crime.
We don't include anti-Israel discourse if it comes within an argument about Israel. But if somebody chucks in, "You dirty Jew," no wonder you say that, then it would become aggravated by a racist element.
Today, the all-party parliamentary group on anti-Semitism is recommending government funding for greater security for synagogues. But the staff at this liberal Jewish one in central London are wary of being too cowed by threats.
I think the Jewish community should be cautious. I don't think they should be afraid. I think there's sort of a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we see armed guards and we assume that we need security, and then we assume we need security, so we have armed guards. And it just means that, especially when you see them at schools and stuff like that, you grow up thinking, I'm Jewish, I need to be protected.
Their rabbi believes security's one thing, winning hearts and minds is as important.
The way you deal with closed minds is by opening doors. The way you deal with closed minds is by encouraging people to think and to be exposed to things. And my real fear is that if we all retreat behind closed doors and fortress synagogues and fortress schools, we've given a victory to the very people we want to defeat.
Back in North London, the guests, many of them who've seen anti-Semitism at its worst, one escaped Holland in 1940, 2 hours before the Germans took control, told me they're too old now to be scared much by thugs or terrorists. Nicola, from a British Jewish family of over 100 years, her meal a success, tells me her view.
I don't think I can worry about it on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, I will be living in fear and they will have won, and I won't.
Joining me now is the former Labour Cabinet Minister Hazel Blears. She was one of the members of the all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism. Hazel Blears, in all the evidence that you received, is the Jewish community fearful?
I think that the Jewish community is cautious. Some members are fearful, and they have a reason to be fearful. The number of attacks in 2014 was double the number of attacks in 2013. So there was a huge spike when the Gaza-Israel dispute was going on. In Manchester, in my own area, again, we saw double the number of incidents. Some were assaults, some were violent, some were just abusive, but very, very unpleasant. So I think there is some fear. But there's also loneliness and there's isolation. And I think that bringing people together and giving them a sense of support is really important here.
How much increased security do you think Jewish schools and synagogues and other Jewish institutions need?
Well, there is already a programme for security at Jewish schools, and that's been very successful. I think that what was said on the piece there about not retreating behind closed doors is really important, because synagogues and schools are part of our community. But when you go to synagogue and you go to school, you have a right to be safe, and therefore there does need to be support for the community. But I would also say that one of the recommendations in the report is about bringing people together, doing much more interfaith work. And if you looked after the killing of Lee Rigby, there was a spike in anti-Muslim incidents. So this is about hatred at its core. It's about intolerance, and it's about what kind of society do we all want to live in. We want to live in one where people can go about their business in peace. And for some, if that means additional security, then I think we should be there for them.
Are you saddened by the fact that there is this, sort of fear felt by a Jewish community that has been well established in the UK after, the Second World War, that we are still dealing with this sort of danger, if you like?
Of course I'm saddened, and I'm saddened by all forms of discrimination and racism. And to me, it's what Hazel Blears is saying, is that we need to find ways of bringing people together to have better dialogue. And also, I think, to look at how historically these things, there's a pattern to these attacks. There's a pattern to the way in which we think about others as alien, as foreign, as different because they dress differently or have different points of views. And importantly for me, and I speak as somebody who's not religious at all, but to me this isn't even about religion. Hatred isn't about religion. Major religions do not preach hatred, actually, and in fact it is much more about coming together. So there's this political sort of nihilistic, almost psychotic at times, drive towards hatred, which has got really nothing to do with religion, and I think people should not be conflating those.
Right. Do new laws need to be introduced in order to protect the Jewish community, the Muslim community, any community that is feeling under threat when and if events abroad seem to have an impact on community relations here?
I don't think so. I think we've got enough law.
Oh, I disagree.
Right.
Okay.
I disagree on one issue, and I think there's something about the internet. I think there's something about social media that at the moment is awash with hatred of all kinds, and that some of the most common used words on social media are Hitler, Jew, Holocaust, and they're very, very slow to take down these hateful postings. And if you look at the extremism and the radicalisation on social media, it is poisoning the minds of many of our young people, and I think that we do need to look at how do we regulate.
Right.
That
well, how
kind of
would you regulate it then? What would you do if somebody did post something on Twitter which did say deny the Holocaust or talk about Hitler being a great thing?
One of the suggestions in the report is to look at something called prevention orders, which currently apply in the realms of sexual offences, where you can compel companies to take down the postings and ban people from being able to post those messages of hatred. Now, the suggestion in the report is let's get the CPS and the Home Office to look, can we extend those prevention orders to things like not just anti-Semitism, but also some of the horrendous radicalisation that's going on our internet.
Right. What about the difficulty when you talked about the spike in anti-Semitic incidents related to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the action the Israelis took? It's difficult, isn't it, for people to talk about those things without, on the one hand, being accused of being anti-Semitic if they're critical of Israel, or the two issues are conflated and actually people are attacking the Jewish community for something they can't necessarily do anything about.
Yeah. I think legitimate political debate of really strongly held views is fundamental to living in our society, and I think that's really precious. When it crosses the line, and for example, I think there was a demonstration around a hairdresser's in Manchester because she was sourcing products from Israel. That poor hairdresser was besieged by violent protests. She was in fear for her own safety. Now, that for me is crossing the line between having a legitimate complaint about Israel's foreign policy and singling out an individual for that kind of abuse.
Do you agree with that? I mean, is it because the two are conflated quite a lot of the time, aren't they?
They are, and they shouldn't be. They are completely separate. If somebody is a Jew, and as you say, you can see walking down the street Hasidic Jews with their hats and whatever, they're readily identifiable. But I really am very much of the view that have to treat foreign policy quite separately. You know, there are quite a lot of Israeli foreign policy decisions that I don't like, or home policy decisions I don't like, but that doesn't make me anti-Jewish.
Right. I mean, your view then in terms of whether new laws should be introduced, should there be a hardening? Bearing in mind we already have incitement laws. Do we really need more legislation to deal with this?
Well, I thought the report that Hazel contributed to was actually very sound in terms of saying there is basically a good network of laws and measures. Yeah. As you say, there was some point at the edges which you've talked about. And I think we're incredibly lucky in this country that we have actually a parliamentary group, an all-party parliamentary group, which is actually looking at this and trying to take things forward. But of course it's a European-wide problem, as we know so sadly from the things that have happened in Paris. It's global, but it's also European, and linked obviously to the Middle East conflicts. And that means I think we have to go, sort of almost talk to people beyond Britain about these issues. But
yes,
but I think today is a good day. A report has come out, and there is an understanding that we have got measures, and we should be using the powers that we got, which I think is a hint was what you were saying. To make sure that there is actually zero tolerance.
What's also encouraging is that we did some polling, and actually British people have a fair understanding of what anti-Semitism is. They're not clear about the impact and the scale of it, but they get, that this is anti-Semitic and it's wrong. And I do think in this country we've got a maturity around our legal system, but we can't rest on our laurels. I think we've got to be ever vigilant, and we've got to take some of the good things that we do across Europe and across the rest of the world. Absolutely we should.
All right, ladies, let's leave it there.